What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my updated Week 15 wide receiver rankings. So earlier in the week, I put up my top 30. We're going to have my top 40 here before Thursday Night Football. If you guys enjoy the video, do me a huge favor, hit that like button and subscribe. Any questions, feel free to drop them down below. But let's just dive right into the rankings here. Not going to spend a ton of time on these tier 1 guys. If you have them, you know they're locked into your lineup. I talked about this earlier in the week. If we wanted to have a million tiers, Jamar Chase would be in a tier by himself, but we're just going to lump him in with the tier 1 guys. So Jamar Chase, Nico Collins, Puka Nacua, Justin Jefferson. Moving into tier 2 here, did have a little bit of, some shakeups here. We're still going to start off with Cooper Kupp. He has scored at least 20 points in 3 of his last 4 games. He is 4th in target share at the wide receiver position, 3rd in target rate, just someone who's going to be peppered with targets on a pretty good offense. Then we have Tyreek Hill, solid back-to-back games. Not been a great season for him, but seems like he's kind of peaking here at the right time. Then I did move Courtland Sutton up. Might have bumped him up 3-4 spots at this point. He has just been so unbelievably consistent. In his last 6 games, he has scored at least 14 PPR points, gone for at least 70 receiving yards, and has been targeted at least 8 times. So with that type of consistent production in a decent matchup, Bo Nix has been playing well. I feel like I have to give him the respect here, even though he wasn't some sort of highly drafted wide receiver. If he is going to be that consistent, giving you a really nice production week in and week out, I think, like I said, have to have him here pretty highly. So he is my wide receiver 7. Then I have Amon-Ra St. Brown going up against the Bills. Under 13 PPR points in his last 3. I think Amon-Ra will be fine. This should be a competitive game script. Could see a decent amount of passing volume. The Lions have the 2nd highest implied point total. We know Amon-Ra is healthy. Just kind of hoping he can get into the end zone here. That's really been the issue over the last 3 weeks. Then we're going to go with Terry McLaurin going up against the Saints. On paper, this is a nice matchup. They're allowing the 7th most points per game to the wide receiver position, and Terry has just been unbelievably consistent. Aside from the first 2 weeks and then one game a couple of weeks ago, he has put up 15 plus points in 7 of his last 8 and 13 plus in 10 out of his last 11. So if he's in your lineup, you're pretty confident he's going to be giving you a nice production. Then I'm going to go with Mike Evans going up against the Chargers. His last 3 have been fine since coming back from injury. 5 for 68, 8 for 118 and a touchdown, 4 for 69. There have been players around him who have better production over their last 3 games, but we know what type of player Mike Evans is, and you just look at this situation. He is the clear-cut top target on a team that's going to be fairly pass-heavy with Baker at quarterback. I think Mike Evans definitely belongs here in the top 10. Then maybe my biggest riser from my video earlier in the week, I bumped up Juwan Jennings, maybe 6-7 spots, going up against the Rams here. In 6 games as a starting wide receiver here for the 49ers, he is averaging 22.3 points per game. And if you want to take away that outlier, I think it was 45 point game, he would still be averaging 17.4 points per game. And, it could make sense to get rid of that huge outlier performance, but the fact that that is in his range of outcomes should definitely still be pointed out here. So Juwan Jennings, wide receiver 1 for the 49ers, probably my biggest riser, like I said. And then the last guy in this tier is going to be Jerry Jeudy going up against the Chiefs. I think he's in this interesting spot here because he's been super impressive over his last 5. 22.7 points per game. I do think he's benefited from Cedric Tillman suffering the concussion, so he left 3 games ago, and then he has missed the last 2. Cedric Tillman might be back this week, was a limited participant, but still has not cleared concussion protocol. But now we have David Njoku with an injury popping up. But as long as one of those guys is out, I still feel very confident with Jerry Jeudy in this fringe wide receiver 1 range. Now moving into tier 3, I think I bumped Ladd McConkey down a spot or 2 just due to the injury uncertainty. I like this matchup. He's been super impressive over his last 3 games. Bucks are top 10 in points per game allowed to the wide receiver position, but he has been limited this week, missed week 14. So just with that injury factor, thought I should put him here in tier 3. Then we have CeeDee Lamb going up against the Panthers here. In a 5-game sample size with Cooper Rush, he is scoring 14.2 points per game. So nothing crazy, coming off a pretty nice performance in week 14. Obviously a super talented wide receiver. Decently soft matchup here against the Panthers. I think he's a nice high-end wide receiver too. Don't know if he has the ceiling of some of the guys ranked ahead of him just based on his offensive situation, but like I said, talented player. going to be involved. Then I have T. Higgins going up against the Titans. I know he's coming off a really rough week 14, but he has been so impressive. Take away that one game. He's still the wide receiver 9 in points per game. I can't just bury him after one tough performance. Then I have A.J. Brown going up against the Steelers. Definitely the guy who maybe was toughest to rank or just like tough to figure out. Do we take his recent production and just completely dock him? Or do we, kind of factor in how good of a player he is and the production he's given us in previous years? And the conclusion that I ultimately arrived at is that I do think we have to dock him here. Like, these are the fantasy playoffs. If you lose this game, you are going home. So if I can put, some players with more consistent, better production ahead of A.J. Brown, I am going to do that. It's also not a good matchup. So that plays a factor here. The Steelers are bottom 6 in points per game allowed to the wide receiver position. A.J. Brown is just not commanding a high volume of targets. A big part of that is just the offense he's on with Saquon dominating. Not going to be a super high volume passing attack, but he's only at 6.6 targets per game. In his last 7, he's averaging 12.7. Now, he's always due for a big game. One play can pretty much make his fantasy day, but I do think we have to, move him down a little bit here from previous rankings just due to the lack of high upside games and the lack of consistency. And then my last guy in this tier is going to be Jackson Smith-Njigba going up against the Packers. In his last 5 games, he is averaging 22 points per game. Looks to be the wide receiver 1 here at this point, consistently outproducing DK Metcalf since he's come back from injury. Now, moving into tier 4, kind of like our mid to back end wide receiver 2s, going to start off with Drake London going up against the Raiders. In his last 4 games, this has been a mix of really nice passing volume and then really poor quarterback play. So he's averaging over 10 targets a game, 46 targets in his last 4, but Kirk Cousins during that stretch has 0 passing touchdowns and 8 interceptions. Maybe this is the matchup where he turns it around, but it's tough to just, automatically assume that when Kirk Cousins has just not looked good over the last 4 games. Then I have Davante Adams going up against the Jaguars. I think I moved him up a spot or 2 here. This is a great matchup on paper. The Jaguars are allowing the 5th most points per game to the wide receiver position. Davante Adams has been the better option out of him and Garrett Wilson over the last 3 games. 13, 17.6, 26 points in his last 3 games. He is being targeted very heavily, 11 or more in 4 of his last 5. I'm still just not all in on this Jets offense, where I think even in a good matchup, they're going to look amazing, but I still think Davante's a nice mid-tier wide receiver 2. Then I have Jacoby Myers going up against the Falcons. It's a really nice matchup, 3rd in points per game allowed. He has been really good without Davante Adams, 15.6 points per game in those 9 games with no Davante. The problem here is just the overall offensive situation here for the Falcons. Looks like Desmond Ridder is going to be the quarterback. Myers has produced with a variety of different options, but it's definitely not good that you keep just swapping around these pretty rough quarterback options. So tough to rank him much higher than this, but a player who's been very good in bad situations. And then I have Garrett Wilson going up against the Jags. Like I mentioned, good matchup. Week 14, 7 for 114. I think some people, just based on the last few weeks, think there's this huge separation between Davante and Garrett Wilson. I don't necessarily see it the same way. Early on when these two are playing together, Garrett Wilson was the better option. Davante's been more consistent over the last 3 games, but I think it was maybe 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, Rodgers missed Garrett Wilson just wide open in the end zone, not a super difficult throw. If that play turns into a touchdown, their production is very, very similar over the last few weeks. And then my last guy in this tier, Malik Neighbors. Nothing against Neighbors. It's a great matchup. 2nd most points per game allowed to wide receivers. This is just such an unbelievably bad offensive situation here. He has not scored a touchdown since week 10. He's been consistent, especially in PPR leagues. He's still getting you 10 plus points. He's commanding a lot of targets, over 10 in his last 6 games, but it's just the upside seems so limited. I think their implied point total this week is all the way down at 13. They're 3 possession underdogs here to the Ravens. So maybe the passing volume's there and he can just volume his way to a solid game. But a lot of these other dudes, you can kind of see the path to a high upside performance. That seems pretty unlikely for Malik Neighbors, just given his offensive situation. Now let's move into tier 5, where I'm going to start off with Josh Downs going up against the Broncos. Returned to practice, missed a game with a shoulder injury, coming off the bye week. But before he suffered that injury, he was averaging 17 points per game in his last 4. Obviously, the quarterback play, a little bit suspect with Anthony Richardson, but Josh Downs has really broken out at this point. He's produced with Flacco. He's produced with A-Rich. I think he belongs here in this like back end wide receiver one range and someone who's going to kind of mix into the slot. So I don't think he's going to be like exclusively drawing the Pat Surtain matchup. Would expect him to be more on like Pittman or potentially whatever outside dude they have, like an Alec Pierce. Then I have Jordan Addison going up against the Bears. Don't think the floor is super high, but it's tough to ignore the ceiling when he has gone for 30 plus PPR points in 2 of his last 3. Week 14, just an insane stat line, 8 for 133 and 3 touchdowns. Early on in the season, the production wasn't great. Hopefully this is something where they're trending in the right direction here, just making an effort to get Jordan Addison more involved, and he's definitely coming through with those opportunities. I'm going to go with Calvin Ridley going up against the Bengals. Everyone knows it's a good matchup for wide receivers going up against the Bengals. His production's been a little iffy as of late, but I do think this is a good bounce back spot. Wide receiver 26, Darnell Mooney, going up against the Raiders. In his last 5 healthy games, he has been pretty consistent, 14 plus points in 4 out of 5 of them, 85 plus yards in those games. So with Drake London, obviously the Kirk factor is somewhat interesting, but the volume's going to be there. He's going to be involved as their number 2 target. Then I have Zay Flowers going up against the Giants. Production's kind of fallen off a little bit as of late. Could be a run-heavy game script here, but Zay Flowers in a game where they're going to put up a lot of points could always be due for one of his boom games. Early in the season, super boomer bust, kind of leveled out a little bit as of late, but it's kind of just been more without those boom games. Then I have Brian Thomas Jr. going up against the Jets. This is not a good matchup on paper, the fewest points per game allowed. Jaguars offense is not great, but Brian Thomas Jr. is just so good. He's gone for 75 plus yards in his last 3 games, commanded 29 targets in those matchups. So even in not ideal situations, he is still managing to produce. Then a guy that I did not originally have in my top 30, I bumped DK Metcalf here up into tier 5. He has had 4 games since he's returned from injury, and their production hasn't been great, 10.9 points per game. But I think the biggest factor here is that he has just not gotten into the end zone. He hasn't necessarily had like a boom game where he's going for over 100 yards, but the biggest factor is just the lack of touchdowns. And when I was looking at my rankings and I had JSN up at like wide receiver 17, and I didn't have DK Metcalf in my top 30, even if I think JSN is going to be the wide receiver 1 rest of season, that just seemed like too much of a gap between the two. So I did move up DK Metcalf a little bit. I would not be shocked if he has a nice bounce back game here in week 15. And then my last guy in this tier is going to be Jalen Waddle going up against the Texans. Started to put it together over his last 3 games, had a 28-point game, 11, 21. This is a great matchup on paper. Texans are allowing the 4th most points per game to the wide receiver position. There are a lot of mouths to feed on this Dolphins offense with Tyreek Hill, Waddle, Jonnu Smith, Devon Achane, but the passing volume, the yards, the touchdowns have consistently been there for Tua, so you're hoping all these dudes can, eat on this offense. Now moving into tier 6, going to start off with DJ Moore going up against the Vikings. On paper, this is the best matchup for wide receivers, number 1 in points per game allowed. I don't know if it's this smash spot because I'm not super high in the Bears offense, and I don't think like a decent matchup for wide receivers is just going to fix all of that. But Moore's been solid, 13.7, 26.9, 23.7, 10.9 in his last 4. So he's found some consistency along with some boom games in there, hoping he can have one here against the Vikings. Then a couple of guys that were like the clear top comments for players who did not make my top 30. Khalil Shakir going up against the Lions, coming off his best fantasy game of the season, 10 for 106 and a touchdown. It's a solid matchup on paper, 8th in points per game allowed. Does seem like they're going to get Keon Coleman back. Maybe that kind of, clouds this wide receiver room, just a lot of mouths to feed, but I still think Khalil Shakir should be fine. He's been a super consistent option, has only scored under 10 PPR points twice throughout this entire season, so nice in this like mid-tier wide receiver 3 range. And then wrapping up this tier with the other dude who people were commenting about, Adam Thielen going up against the Cowboys. No doubt he has had back-to-back really nice performances, 8 for 99 and a touchdown, 9 for 102. A lot of people seem to be like fully buying in on Adam Thielen. For me, it's a little bit sketchy. I mean, if you remember last year, right, Thielen was amazing. We were getting towards the end of the season. We saw this huge fall off. Now, it's not apples to apples. This is a much better offensive situation. Bryce Young is playing at a much higher level. But even looking at his Vegas line, like his receiving yard over under is 51.5. So even they're not anticipating he like continues to have these monster games. So maybe I'm too low on Thielen. the situation just feels a little bit sketchy, and I'm not sure if he's going to replicate what he's done in the past 2 games. And then we're going to move into my final tier, tier 7. Some interesting names here. I guess some guys who have overachieved, some dudes who have underachieved. We're going to start off with Marvin Harrison Jr. going up against the Patriots. Pretty much the definition of boomer bust. He has 6 games of 15 plus, and then he has 7 games of 9 or fewer. So he's not getting you 10, 11, 12 points. He's either giving you like 17, 18, higher, or he's just completely flopping in your lineup. Then I have D-Hop going up against the Browns. He scored at least 13 points in his last 3 games, 9 targets in back-to-back matchups. The problem is just that he's not racking up a ton of, receptions and receiving yards on a consistent basis. He has gone for under 40 receiving yards in 3 of his last 4 games. Then I'm going to go with Jameson Williams going up against the Bills. In his last 3 games, he's averaging 11.5 points per game on 22 total targets. Now, that might not feel significant, like 11.5 points per game. You're not super excited to throw that into your lineup. But what I want to point out is he has done that with no touchdowns. And Jameson Williams, I think a lot of people, including myself, thought heading into this season he was going to be like this boom bust option where he has the potential to rip off a 50-yard reception, a 30-yard touchdown run, and that would be the way he kind of pays off for fantasy. And he still has that big play, ceiling within him. But if he can at least give you somewhat of a floor, it makes him a lot more palatable play, even if he doesn't, get that long touchdown. Then I'm going to go with Devonta Smith going up against the Steelers. Pretty rough stretch here for Devonta Smith. Had a solid start, but in his last 3 games, these are his total stats combined for his last 3. 8 receptions for 80 yards and a touchdown. That would be like a really nice game in 1 week. That is his total production from the last 3. It's not been going well. Like I talked about with A.J. Brown, also not a great matchup. Then I'm going to go with Jaden Reed going up against the Seahawks. This was a dude who was absolutely balling out early on in the season. At some point, it looked like he was going to be a fantasy wide receiver 1. That production has really fallen off. The efficiency hasn't been there, hasn't had the same touchdown luck. Week 14, 0 points, goose egg on 1 target. Like, it's tough to trust someone who could, goose eggs happen. You don't love it, but it happens. On only 1 target, that's the really tough part. He has had 3 or fewer receptions in 6 out of 7 games, so there's just very limited floor here. And if he's not ripping off a big play, a long touchdown run, it's going to be tough for him to be a playable option. My wide receiver 39, kind of an interesting spot to rank him. It is Cedric Tillman going up against the Chiefs. He was limited Wednesday with that concussion. There's no guarantee he plays this week, but in the 4 games with Jameis where he was healthy, he's averaging 18.6 points per game. So it's possible that with Judy kind of breaking out, his role is going to be limited. But if we get into a spot where David Njoku is potentially missing and Cedric Tillman stepping in, I could see Tillman being a very strong fantasy option. Now it gets a little bit sketchier if Njoku's healthy, Cedric Tillman entering back into this wide receiver room, potentially as the 3rd target. So, a lot of different ways this one could go. And then my last guy here, Amari Cooper going up against the Lions, coming off a 14 target week 14, turned it into 6 for 95. I don't feel overly confident in Amari Cooper. Keon Coleman should be back. But, decent matchup. They're going to put up points. Could be interesting. And then honorable mentions to Keenan Allen and then Deebo Samuel. I think Deebo's more interesting if Garendo does not play. Was hoping he would get some running back usage last week. Maybe that would lead to some running back usage this week. And then for Keenan Allen, he's really had, I think, 3 games, 20 plus, has not hit 10 plus in any of his other matchups. So he has also been very boomer bust, but could have slotted in here in one of those final spots. That is going to wrap it up for my top 30. Let me know your thoughts down below. Any questions, would love to answer them. Thank you all for stopping by, and I'll see you in the next one.